die in your sins. He justified and got us a win. Isaiah 53 verse 11, and I'm preaching the gospel, got me on 10. He justified me, look where I've been. Now when we still we can step with no sins. Set a book for the word out of friend. To those that believe to the very end. If you don't believe, you gon' die in your sins. He justified and got us a win. Isaiah 53 verse 11, and I'm preaching the gospel, got me on 10. He justified me, look where I've been. Now when we still we can step with no sins. Set a book for the word out of friend. To those that believe to the very end. But the devil don't like this. All by that blood, I'm righteous. We keep it laws, we fight this. What they gon' say when that brightness come? Testify me, tell the devil get behind me. Acts 13:39, see, got the truth, you can never find me. Bearing this fruit when I wake up. I believe that he rose from the dirt. A couple of us been in the hearse. So now that we got the faith, should we may void the law? Do you understand, Paul? You got the blood to cover it all. We got a mediator when we fall. Now when we step on the sins. Set a book for the word out of friends. To those that believe to the very end. If you don't believe, you gon' die in your sins. He justified and got us a win. Isaiah 53 verse 11, and I'm preaching the gospel, got me on 10. He justified me, look where I've been. Now when we can step on those sins. He set a book for the word out of friends. To those that believe to the very end.
All right, y'all, so I'm gonna finish off this article where we left off. And that I put in the keyboard. I'll just do this like this. Here we go. So once we get to the keyboard, So pharaohs and kings are mentioned next as murderers, adulterers, and lovers of war, with this result taken of life, liberty, and property. God neither instituted nor established these civil governments. We discussed the kings of Israel and later of Judah. The existence of these kings itself was a result of the evil choice of the people first rejecting God as their king. Saul, David, and Solomon were progressively worse as kings when compared to the limitations of civil power stated in Deuteronomy 17. Most of subsequent kings did evil, and God killed a few kings himself. The only government God ever created was self-government and the family through marriage, childbearing, and rearing, and dominion. Be fruitful, multiply, go replenish the earth. What's going on? Now I'm Warren, SSV, peace be unto you, man. Thank you for joining. Make sure you hit the like button. So, the history of civil government is punctuated by the description of the evils described in 1 Samuel chapter 8 and the need for limits on civil power referenced in Deuteronomy 17. We discussed how civil government, specifically led by pharaohs and kings, would take from the people by force their labor, property, increase, and children, and as a result, you shall be his slaves. 1 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 17. This is God's view of the civil governments of all the nations of that day. Little has changed. God advised that the people should limit their selection of leaders to natural born persons He advised that the people should limit the power of the civil government regarding offensive wars, restrict the accumulation of massive wealth taken from the people, avoid entangling foreign alliances and treaties. The United States ain't do that. They got a United Embassy. They got a United States Embassy in almost every country. It says, avoid entangling foreign alliances and treaties, and ensure that the law govern both the people and governmental officials equally. All were under the law of God and law of the land. Law was not to be used lawlessly. See also 1 Timothy chapter 1 verse 8. We know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully. So with this background in mind and understanding what God has said about civil governments in the past, we come to Romans 13. Is Paul, the author of Romans, laying down a new doctrine of civil government never before heard of by mankind? Is he rejecting what God has said about civil government and kings of the nations as recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 8? What is Paul actually saying? Is he trying to reconcile what God said way back then with the modern Roman civil government and its Caesar? When looking at Romans 13, understand that few people have any meaningful understanding of what you have read from previous chapters regarding 1 Samuel chapter 8 or Deuteronomy 17. They have never put one and one together, the Old and New Covenants and Testaments. They have never heard anything substantial about civil government as covered in prior chapters. Regretfully, they do not even know they should be asking what God thinks about civil government. Do you? Did you? No. They come to Romans 13 like sheep to the slaughter, ready to conclude that unlimited submission is God's will in the order of the day. Romans chapter 13, verse 1 to 7 states, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. That don't mean what you think you just heard. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. So who are the authorities? Not pharaohs and kings. Let us break this down. What's going on? Mamis 2, peace be unto you. Thank you for joining in. Make sure you hit that like button. Let's break this down. Romans 13 first says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. Stop right there. Who are these governing authorities? Don't jump to any conclusions. Reason it out from what the Bible says. So far, we have seen that the authorities include first God as the supreme and highest authority. We also know that human beings were created by God to exercise authority over themselves, their physical bodies, their health, their mind, and hearts. We know that human beings are of two types, male and female. To them are given the authority to exercise dominion over the earth, to possess and own property, and to labor and enter into marriage and voluntary associations. Excuse me. To them as husband and wife are also given the authority to be fruitful and multiply, and to oversee and direct the education and upbringing of their own children. So mankind is an authority established by God, not government, mankind. A husband and wife are authorities established by God. A father and mother are authorities established by God. So this is clearly what Paul is talking about so far. We also know the universal church was established by Yeshua, who y'all say Jesus, when he instituted his church and gave its members authority. In Matthew chapter 28, verse 18 to 20, he stated, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. Note, Yeshua's or Jesus reference to his authority. He references his authority. Paul says, be subject to the governing authorities. Yeshua, who y'all say called Jesus, is certainly a governing authority. Of course, God did not create your local church down the street. It is not an authority God established despite its claims to the contrary. It has no inherited or delegated authority to govern any person. Your local church is established as a non-profit corporation under state law with this internal structure of control dictated by law. That structure has nothing to do with the church Jesus established, of which he is the head, and all believers stand equally under him. His church has no new rules or ordinances. It requires only what has always been required, that we should love God and our neighbor as ourselves. His church therefore differs radically from the local assembly down the street with its rules and traditions of men and its man-made authority structure or hierarchy. As noted, a husband and wife have authority to govern their household. Parents are governing authorities. They have authority to govern their children. Therefore, according to Paul, whoever resists these authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Isn't it good to know that if you resist the petty tyranny of your local church, you will not incur the judgment of God for it? Are you reading? Am I reading Bible? I'm actually reading an article. Origin of Civil Government, Its True Human Origin, Limited Jurisdiction on lonang.com. It's a 178-page PDF document. I'm on page 110. So, isn't it good to know that if you resist the petty tyranny of your local, all right, people, do the civil authorities resist what God has appointed? God appointed the father and mother to educate their children. The civil government resists that authority by compulsory school attendance and curriculum requirements. God says that such resistance will incur his judgment. This is an easy one to see. We could provide more examples, but you get the point. Are you ready to add civil government to the list of governing authorities? Not so fast. Where does God establish civil authority? What chapter or verse? Let's go back to the first Pharaoh in Genesis 12. He was a man inclined to murder, a man who took what he wanted by force, a man who controlled land and agriculture, a man who determined who can reside in his kingdom, a man who ordered others to do his will, and a man who God punished for defiling the marriage covenant of Abraham and Sarai. Here is a man who believes he is the law. Is this what God instituted? Is this an authority unto whom Abraham must submit? What say you? Do you think this is what Paul is commanding? That Abraham should have obeyed Pharaoh as an act of obedience to God and letting him take his wife as his own? If this is what you think, that God commanded this, then why did God threaten to harm or kill Pharaoh for that conduct? And what about the first reference to kingdoms at Babel in Genesis 11 or kings in Genesis 14? You remember the ones? They are remembered, excuse me, for their conduct principally in terms of waging war, confiscating booty, and enslaving human captives. They abducted Abraham's nephew Lot and took all his possessions in their war. Did Paul say submit to such as these? Is this an authority unto whom Abraham was required to submit? Apparently, Abraham did not think so. When Abraham heard that his nephew had been taken captive, he mobilized his 318 trained men who had been born in his household, and he pursued the invaders as far as Dan. Then during the night, Abraham divided his forces against them and defeated them. He chased them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. He retrieved all the stolen property. He also brought back his nephew Lot and his possessions, as well as the woman and the rest of the people. Genesis 14, verse 14 and 16. Are you ready to tell Abraham that he should have submitted to these kings as the minister of God? Are you ready to tell Abraham that he should turn the other cheek and just let the kings keep his nephew? Look at the words God uses to describe the conduct of the kings. They took captives, they were invaders, they stole property. Are you ready to tell Abraham that submission to this government is mandated by God? Speak up. And let's look back at the Egyptians. They put 4 men over the Israelites to oppress them with hard labor. Exodus 1 and verse 11. And when Moses said, let the people go, and Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey him by releasing Israel? I do not know the Lord, and I will not release Israel. So would you advise Moses to respond, well, that settles that, we will obey? Would you remind Moses that whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed? Would you remind Moses that he should have no fear of the one who is in authority? Exodus chapter 5, verse 2. Or is God just giving conflicting advice here, telling Moses one thing and Paul another? How do you see it? Is God confused, or are you? What about Nahash, the Ammonite, who said that the only way he could make a treaty with Israel was to allow him to gouge out the right eye of every male? 1 Samuel chapter 11, verse 2. If he had defeated Israel in war, would you remind Samuel to command all the people to line up like sheep to have their eye gouged out? Because Paul will say one day, for he, Nahash, is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. That's what y'all say about the police. What of the 42 kings of Israel and Judah that keep giving them more funding, right? And they keep getting caught with small people on their phones and all type of stuff. What of the 42 kings of Israel and Judah and one king? Of the 42 kings, they held back the E-files, the Jeffrey Epstein files. Of the 42 kings, 15 were killed or assassinated by others. God killed 3 and 2 killed themselves. So of the 19 kings of Israel, 7 were killed by individuals who killed the king in the coup and then assumed power. All 19 kings of Israel are described as evildoers. Every single king did evil. Among the kings of Judah, 12 were described by God as evildoers. 8 kings were described as good. Are any or all of these pharaohs and kings governing authorities referenced by Paul unto whom God commands submission? No. We know what you are thinking. You are thinking, well, Paul said we should submit to the government as a minister of God for our good. So does that mean you would advise the people of Israel? Sure, every one of your kings was an evildoer, but you have to submit anyway, and for your own good be impoverished, enslaved, or murdered. You have lost perspective. Do we have to single out all the kings and civil governments on the earth and illustrate their evil course of conduct? And against this weight of evidence, you maintain unlimited submission is mandated? There is no reasoning left. God did not make us to enjoy liberty to obey him and then throw it all away for obedience to civil government. He did not make individuals and the family to govern themselves and then tell Paul to write they should throw it all away and preach in submission to civil government. Romans 13 says the authority must be established by God. Human beings have authority as individuals, husbands, wives, and parents. Human beings have authority as believers to render to their Creator those obligations required by him. This liberty was recognized in the 1776 Virginia Bill of Rights. Kings and civil officials do not have authority in this way. They are not established by God. True it is that David realized that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and that he had elevated his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. 1 Chronicles 14 and 2. But this was by the consent of the people and first demanding a king, and pursuant to God's authority as their king previously agreed upon 300 years prior. It is no rule for any other king or nation. So Paul says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Recall what Peter said, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13 and 14. A king in a kingdom is a human institution. A human instruction is not an authority established by God. It is established by human beings. How many times do we have to go over this? Peter and Paul say in effect, the authorities that exist have been instituted by God, and civil government is not one of them. Paul then writes, therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. In other words, the authorities that exist that are instituted by God are the husband and wife, mother and father, and his son, Jesus, Yeshua. If you resist their limited and lawful authority, you incur God's judgment. But since civil government is a human institution, it is not an authority. And if you resist this human institution, you will not incur God's judgment. You may incur the judgment of the human institution, but not God's judgment. Rulers are not to be wicked tyrants. Next, Paul adds, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. So what does this mean? Paul is speaking of a civil government that acts lawfully. When it acts lawfully, it is a terror to bad conduct. He is also saying God uses civil government to punish wrongdoing. God uses civil governments when the people consent to establish those civil governments, and the civil official exercises that authority lawfully given. God uses any civil government how he wants, just like he will use you and me how he wants. But this does not mean civil governments are created by God or that their command and punishments are automatically just. A civil government not established by the people, but rather established over the people by force of arms or conquest or some other tyrannical way is not God's recognized way of establishing a civil government, but it can be used by God nonetheless. What does Paul say about the authority of Nero, Herod, or of Agrippa? What does he say about the authority of Caesar? Paul said we must honor God instead of man. To the who was that? The high priest or whoever. Are these terrorists? Are these rulers a terror to bad conduct? Are these rulers God's servant for the good of Romans? Are these rulers the servant of God and avenger who carries out God's wrath on a wrongdoer? No, they are none of these things. Paul cannot mean that these people are to be obeyed when they themselves do not submit to God. He cannot mean that we are to obey our civil officials when they do not submit to God. Paul is not sanctioning the abuse of power by wicked men. And what authority would God have them exercise? There's only one type of authority, and it is lawful authority. We know the authority God would not have them exercise. He has told us in 1 Samuel chapter 8 and Deuteronomy 17, he would not have them exercise the lawless authority of the kings of the nations of the earth. He would not have them exercise the lawless authority he cautions Israel to specifically limit and prohibit. He would not have them exercise the powers which God warned against in 1 Samuel chapter 8. He would not have them exercise lawless authority to take, and take. He would not have them exercise lawless authority to take our children or take our land and property. He would not have them exercise lawless authority to take our freedom, control our medical choices, make us slaves, or increase their wealth through governing and taxes. He would not have them exercise lawless authority to establish a large standing army. militarize law enforcement, or erect a military empire. He would not have them exercise lawless authority to lord their power over us or to exempt them from the law which applies to everyone else. He would not have them exercise the lawless authority to entangle the nation in non-defensive wars of foreign aggression or establish worldwide global hegemony over all nations. He would not have them exercise the lawless authority to practice rendition, torture, or incite nuclear Armageddon. Paul is not instructing us to obey tyrants. Paul is speaking of lawful purposes, which citizens have the authority to and actually choose to voluntarily extend to their civil governments. He is not referring to the abuse of power by wicked men holding an office, position, or title. The mere possession of a title or office is no guarantee of the lawfulness of its authority. Simply because a person is the president and claims to exercise presidential authority does not mean that all acts done in the name of the president or in the office of the man or woman are lawful. Simply because a person is a congressional representative or a senator or a justice of the Supreme Court does not mean when they act or speak that it is presumed lawful. If there is a presumption to be attached to the acts of the legislator and of the conduct of the executive branch, is that they are lawless and unconstitutional when judicially challenged, and that the burden is on the government to establish their lawfulness and constitutionality. Article 1, Section 10, 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt Executive Order, all gold given to the bankers. 1934, Louis McFadden exposed the Federal Reserve fraud congressional record. And the treason that all politicians create every day and commit every day. The penalty for treason is death. Modern judicial decisions, however, adopt the opposite presumption. They presume the lawfulness and constitutionality of legislative acts and of executive decisions. The kings of Israel, all of which God declared did evil, would have enjoyed such a presumption. How different is this repeated misunderstanding of judicial responsibility when compared to his warnings about the inherent disposition of the legislative branch to fly off into orbit, claiming any power they choose, as elaborated upon by Thomas Jefferson. He wrote that, in question of power then, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. In the Kentucky resolutions of 1798, he noted that judicial review is not worthy of the name where the presumption of constitutionality is accorded to the acts of the legislator. Indeed, Paul is not naive as are modern jurists. Though he lays out the best case for obeying civil government, he does not presume that its acts are inherently good or lawful or constitutional. When civil rulers act lawfully, they should be obeyed as a practical matter, and when they act unlawfully or lawlessly, we have no obligation to obey them. Judicially created canons of presuming constitutionality and avoiding constitutional questions are ill-suited to a constitution designed to limit civil government precisely because an expansive civil power is a dangerous thing. These canons of construction assume what they should reject. Power is dangerous and should be checked at every step, not given a free pass. In its most common articulation, the presumption of constitutionality deters the court from striking down an act of Congress, except upon a clear showing of unconstitutionality. Similarly, the canon of constitutional avoidance provides that where an otherwise acceptable construction of a statute would raise serious constitutional problems, the court will construe the statute to avoid such problems unless such construction is plainly contrary to the intent of Congress. Ashwander versus Tennessee Valley Authority. These extra constitutional canons should be rejected. The civil government deserves only the presumption that its actions are lawless, and it must bear and carry the burden of proving otherwise. The key concepts: authorities, conscience, and servant explained. Paul next asserts, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. God is against the wrongdoer. If the people establish a civil government and clothe it with lawful authority, by a non-exclusive delegation of their authority to punish crimes against persons and property, then in that sense, a civil government is an avenger of God's wrath on a wrongdoer. If the people, however, do not establish such a civil government, but it arises by force or fraud over the people, or becomes a civil government, that's why I keep telling y'all 1934 Federal Reserve fraud, Louis McFadden. Donald Trump won't do nothing about this, or your local politicians, your cousin that work in the government, your uncles, your sheriff, your granddad on the sheriff. But it arises by force or fraud over the people, or becomes a civil government over the people and subjugates them, then its mere power to punish crimes against persons and property may still serve the purpose of executing God's wrath against the wrongdoer. But the legitimacy of such a civil government is not automatically established. Recall Hosea chapter 8, verse 4. They made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, but I knew it not. Recall Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, which God describes as my servant. Jeremiah 25:9. There was also Cyrus, king of Persia, whom God calls his shepherd and my anointed. Isaiah 44:28 and 45:1. These kingdoms were not instituted by the consent of the people, but God used them anyway. They were nothing more, however, than human institutions. The point is that Paul is describing the best of civil governments when created by human beings with their consent. So, at the end of the day, Paul is still describing a human institution at its best. The fact that God uses good and bad human institutions is rather unremarkable. He uses us, doesn't he? Even though we are sinful. He uses the church, doesn't he? Even though it is weighed down with myopic pastors, weak leadership, and milk-fed members. Let us turn to the above statements about conscience. Paul refers to obedience for conscience sake. What is this? He is talking about our conscience. He is indicating that we can choose to obey for the sake of our conscience when the civil government acts lawlessly. We obey them in order to avoid their immediate lawless wrath. We may be wise and not throw ourselves before the civil governmental juggernaut. We may elect to obey a lawless government so that we may continue to do that which God has called us to do without the interference or the punishment of an evil ruler. This is a pragmatic consideration. This is a practical consideration. Do you want to stay out of jail? Do you want to avoid your assets being levied by the Internal Revenue Service? Do you want to avoid serving a prison sentence? Do you want to avoid the police kicking in your door and taking your property? Let us assume each thing when done are wrongly done in your case, and that they are done lawlessly by the civil ruler. Nevertheless, Paul is saying that you may want to submit anyway, because the evil you submit to is less invidious than being denied the freedom to do what is right with the money you have left, or the freedom you have when not incarcerated. Paul is giving advice. He is not, however, laying down a rule of conduct for every person. We may observe it to our benefit or ignore it at our peril. It is up to each person to decide to obey a lawless civil government, judge, police officer, or federal agent based on pragmatic considerations. The choice to disobey is not a sin which God will punish, though Caesar will look upon it as contempt or a crime. But what did you expect? That Caesar's lawless command would not be followed by a lawless punishment? So we have to be prudent. Paul is giving us practical advice, not the immutable law of God. Paul also says, therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are servants of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. This is the practice that applies when a civil government acts lawfully, not in all cases. Paul is switching gears. He's focusing on those times when the civil government does what the people have lawfully entrusted it to do. Why would God be angry if we fail to pay taxes to support good government? His wrath would arise because the government established by the people do what is lawful, costs money to operate. But he is not angry when we refuse to pay taxes when that government is lawless. He may also be wrathful because the will of God is that by doing good, you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. 1 Peter 2:15. Non-payment of taxes provides an easy target for the government to attack his people. Perhaps God is in effect saying, pay your taxes so as not to offend the government. Or as Matthew wrote down what Yeshua said, but so that we don't offend them, go to the lake and throw out a hook. Take the first fish that comes up, and when you open its mouth, you will find a 4 drachma coin. Take that and give it to them for you and me. For me and you. Matthew 17:24-27. This puts the idea of tax exemption in a whole new light. If your church is tax exempt and then chastises you to pay taxes because of Romans 13, ask them why it does not pay taxes. The only answer is that found in Matthew chapter 17, verse 25. The kings of the earth do not tax their own sons, i.e., your ministers in church. In further regard to the payment of taxes, it follows that governmental officials who are occupied in such affairs most easily take offense when money is in question. Therefore, we pay taxes as our conscience dictates, so that we may avoid the wrath of an evil government or interference of a good one. But at some point, we must say no more. Remember that the people and Jeroboam came to Rehoboam to ask him if he would limit his power and relieve them of conscription and heavy oppressive taxes. Jeroboam and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam and said to him, your father put a heavy yoke on us, and now lighten a harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you. 1 Kings 12, verse 3 and 4. Rehoboam said no, and threatened to increase their taxes even more. As a result, the people declared their separation from his rule. When all Israel saw that King Rehoboam refused to listen to them, they answered the king, what share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David. 1 Kings chapter 12 and verse 16. A misreading of Paul's statement makes no provision for this tax revolt or declaration of the causes that impelled them to separation, yet it had God's blessing. We have addressed the concept of authorities instituted by God and the idea of conscience. Let us turn to the last key concept in Romans 13, what is meant by saying he is God's servant for your good, and that the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. As we noted, this very thing is punishing wrongdoing, not punishing doing right or interfering with the authorities God established, like self-government, husband, wife, father, and mother. We also noted that when civil government acts, it often is a very incompetent or an evil minister. Just being called a minister of God, however, does not cloth the civil government with God's authority. It simply means that when the people have established a civil government by their consent and clothed its officials with limited authority to punish specific wrongdoing, Then that official acts as God's minister through the people's consent. Israel's evil kings and queen were not governing authorities instituted by God, nor were they God's servant for good. Romans chapter 13, verse 1 to 4. Didn't God kill a few along the way? They are not authorities either. Though Paul calls them ministers of God, they were not good ministers worthy of any obedience. Impeachment, not obedience, is their lot. So, we cannot take Paul's admonition as a universal rule of conduct, nor is Paul the Lord of any man's conscience. He may appeal to our conscience and advocate that it should dictate the payment of taxes or submission to civil officers, but it is my conscience and your conscience that is to be exercised and is only accountable to God for the exercise thereof. Paul's admonition cannot bind anyone's conscience in these matters except his own, nor did he intend to do so. If you remember nothing about this chapter, remember that, yes, the civil government will take note of your conscience. It will create a list with you on it. It will mark you as someone to watch and perhaps prosecute at some point in time. But this does not mean it acts lawfully. 4,000 years, and what do we know? The sum of the matter so far is this: God does not institute or establish civil government. The kings of the earth arise by force, conquest, or the consent of human beings, but not by divine will. Remember also that the Lord has established his throne in heaven. His kingdom extends over everything. Psalm 103 and 19. All nations and kingdoms are subordinate to him. If the people choose to establish a civil government, wisdom dictates it should be one of very limited power. It must be limited to those lawful objects which the people themselves have the authority in the first place to extend to a civil government. When that government acts lawlessly or goes beyond the limited authority lawfully given to it, then the people have no need to obey it. God does not require it. Paul does not advise it. Yet, every person may submit as a pragmatic matter so that they may continue to enjoy their life, though diminished, their families, though regulated, their religion, though confined, their employment, though subject to control, their wealth, though partially taken, and their freedom, though systematically denied or disparaged on a relative scale. But we do not see in Romans 13 the announcement of a never before heard doctrine of civil government. We do not see God declaring that civil governments are authorities he has instituted. We do not see God waking up after 4,000 years of human history and saying, well, I guess now that the Romans are the world's superpower, I better share with Paul some insights about civil government that I never bothered to communicate before. We do not see the doctrine of unlimited submission to civil magistrates. We do not see the nonsense that every civil official from the president down to the dog catcher is God's agent, no matter what. Paul says that civil officials are ministers of God, but their office is a human institution. It is created by humans. But ministers sent by God are not authorities instituted by God. God did not clothe them with civil power. Only people can do that. Nor does it mean that civil officials are automatically good ministers. The presumption should be to the contrary. Read the books of God's own kings, whom he himself calls evil. In a nutshell, Romans 13 essentially offers nothing new after 4,000 years of human history. It offers only the pragmatic observation that obedience to civil government ought to be guided by our individual conscience. Submission may cost us less in the short term than disobedience in the long term. It also reaffirms that the authorities set up by God are the individual, the family, and later on the Church of Christ, which has but one head, Yeshua, Christ. Your favorite religious corporation down the street you call the church shares no power from Jesus to dictate submission, mandate belief, or command your conscience. Don't you give it to him either. The Creator gave it to you to exercise in self-government.
Finally, yo, what's going on? Rob Matthews, peace be unto you. Thank you for joining. Would you want to be in an event I have this Saturday for a cash prize? Yeah, man, hit me up. Email me. CasperTheGreat@gmail.com. CASPATHEGREAT@gmail.com. And I'm about to screenshot you. I might have to search you up because I think you're lying. If you're lying, I'm gonna expose you, Matthew. I'm gonna find out your IP address and I'm gonna put you in my community tab. That's what I do with wicked people. So let's continue. So finally, the scriptures affirm that when established by the people, a civil government might act as a minister or servant of God, but this is no guarantee that it will act lawfully or as a good servant or an obedient minister. Nor is it a declaration that any civil office is an authority or established by God. Indeed, they made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, but I knew it not. Hosea chapter 8, verse 4. If you have that yellow marker handy, this would be a good paragraph to highlight. Is every government under God in a jurisdictional sense? Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. Psalm chapter 2, verse 1 and 6. So God reigns over the nations. God is seated on his holy throne. Psalm 47 and 8. The law of nature denies civil government unlimited jurisdiction, even by consent. We have completed our chronological survey of the Bible and concluded that civil government and civil officials are purely the creation of human decisions. God does not make them. He does not establish them. He does not institute them. He does, however, use them for his purposes. He also rules over the nations. He is the king of the nations and their governments. What does this mean in practice when the people establish a civil government or a dictator comes to rule by force and violence? Recall that civil government, when established, cannot impair the jurisdiction, prerogatives, or purpose of any pre-existing authority. The people cannot, if they establish a civil government, give it just any old power they please, even by free consent. The people cannot violate the law of nature. The people cannot lawfully declare that God shall have no say in what powers they may extend to their civil government. If they do so in defiance of God, the Creator. The civil government cannot lawfully violate the law of nature, and any attempts to do so, though they may be successful, are lawless and not the will of God. God laughs at such presumption. He holds such governments and nations in derision. The people cannot lawfully give civil government any authority which God has given to another authority. God established at the creation one kind of authority, mankind. He gave man, male and female, governing authority over the earth, but not over other persons. Man has no impelled authority over another man. No man has a right to govern another without his free consent. Mankind is capable of self-government with no civil government ever existing or brought into existence by consent or otherwise. But if the people do establish a civil government, they have no right or authority to set aside what God has created and say to the civil government they create, here, government, you exercise jurisdiction that God retained for himself or gave exclusively to men and women, husbands and wives, parents and children, or the church. God has established the authority of a husband and wife. How? He did this by defining marriage and then empowering a man and woman to mutually consent to be husband and wife in marriage. He established the authority of the family and charged it with continually governing their part of the earth with their own labor, property, and land. God also added duties pertaining to bearing, rearing, and the education of children to the family's charge. The family does not need or require any civil government to fulfill its familial purposes.
If the people establish a civil government, they cannot by their consent declare that the authority which God gave to the family shall no longer be exercised by the family, or this authority shall be regulated, diminished, or impaired. The people in making constitutions or their agents in the legislature making subordinate laws have no jurisdiction, right, or authority to set aside what God has created and say in a law or constitution, here, civil government, you exercise a jurisdiction that God gave exclusively to the individual and the family. This is a hard fact to accept in a day and age where the government claims to help build strong families and politicians solicit votes on that basis. But the civil government does no such thing as build strong families. And the sooner we see this, the better off we will be. The people cannot violate the law of nature and family. The government cannot violate the law of nature of family. Attempts to empower the civil government to substitute its judgment and will for that of the family as given by God trigger his fury. We may have to obey these lawless acts as a practical matter, but any obedience we show is not because God requires us to do so. It is because we wish to enjoy what liberty is left rather than challenge the entire system of lawlessness. So these are the authorities that exist: man, male and female, husbands and wives, and fathers and mothers. They govern themselves, their families, their households, and rear their own children. Civil government is unnecessary to their existence or purpose. What other authorities has God instituted? For Christians, Jesus or Yeshua established his church of which he is the head. Colossians 1:18. It is a voluntary society based on faith, reason, and persuasion with its own internal structure and purposes, lacking the power of force or coercion. 1 Corinthians 12:28. How about civil government? Did God establish civil government? The answer is no. God did not establish civil government. That nations exist and civil governments eventually arose either by consent or by force of arms from the original act of God confusing human language is not to say God created civil governments. God created languages, and as a result, humanity scattered into language groups, each occupying different geographical regions. These regions develop borders and assume the particulars of nationality built on their unique language and fraternal identity. From one man he made every nation of the human race to inhabit the entire earth, determining their set times and the fixed limits of the places where they will live, so that they will search for God and perhaps grope around for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. Acts chapter 17, verse 26 to 27. He did this by confusing human language at Babel. Genesis 11, verse 1 to 9. Only in this context is civil government even to be discussed. It is not discussed as a divine right emanating directly from God to a ruler. While God created man and established marriage and the family, there is no comparable creation of civil government by God himself. A civil government exists by the consent of the people or by the declaration of a despot backed by the sword and violence. It does not exist because God said, "Let there be civil government." He never said this in any general way for the nations. Some argue that the inherent authority of civil rulers is to punish murderers. Genesis chapter 9, verse 4 to 6. But when God extended such a power to mankind, there were no civil governments in existence. Some argue that God established a civil government in ancient Israel. They ignored that its origins were by the consent of the people, and later that he objected to their demand for a king as a rejection of himself. They rejected me as being king over them. Yet he allowed the people to make their foolish choice, and they readily agreed to be the slaves of their human kings. Exodus chapter 19, verse 7 to 9, and 1 Samuel chapter 8. So, what is the lawful authority a people may delegate to their civil government? Recall, we have been reviewing the scripture chronologically to understand
what God has said about civil government, including its authority and jurisdiction, we have seen that God established nations not for their own purposes, but rather so the language divided peoples of the earth should be prevented from greatness without God, and so that the people may seek him and perhaps find him. He also established nations so they would expand out over the entire face of the earth as he originally mandated. Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. The only human government in existence originated by God, if it could be called that, is through the family, with humans authorized to punish murderers by death since the time of Noah, the avenger of the wrongdoer, the avenger of blood, meaning the family of the person who got killed. So in all other respects, this familial authority was extant from the beginning of time. While there is no evidence that God authorized individual human beings to punish crimes other than murder, we note that murder is a crime against persons. One might conclude that the authority to punish murderers includes by implication the authority to punish other lesser offenses against a person. Such offenses, generally speaking, would include all of the degrees of homicide, assaults, and battery against a person, branding, maiming, disfigurement, and torture of all types, kidnapping, false imprisonment, or confinement, illegal arrests and searches, molestation, rape, and criminal sexual conduct, coerced medical procedures, including treatment, vaccination and sterilization, feticide, and enslavement. Such an analysis would conclude that the victim's family has authority from God to effect its own remedy short of death for these offenses. We have an example of how one does not avenge rape. Recall that Simon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and killed all the males of the Canaanites as retaliation for one man's defilement of Dinah. Genesis 34, verse 25. This is an example of excess. Their father, upon learning of it, declared, "You have brought trouble on me by making me stink to the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. My numbers are few, and if they gather themselves against me and attack me, I shall be destroyed, both I and my household." Genesis 34 and 30. He later described his sons as such lawless measures as weapons of violence. Genesis 49 and verse 5. If this same logic is applied to offenses against property, it would be reasonable that God gave dominion to the family over the animals, food, things, and property, both real and personal, in Genesis 2. As such, the family has authority to secure its own property from interference or alienation by others. The family enjoys authority to use force to prevent its property from being stolen. It has authority to recover by force, if needed, its own stolen property. An example of this authority to recover persons or property in action can be found in Abraham's use of armed force to rescue his nephew Lot, his family, and all his property from Lot's kidnapping or enslavement, and theft of all his property recorded in Genesis chapter 14, verse 12 to 16. Recall that Genesis chapter 9 in verse 6 says, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image." If you are looking for the property delegation equivalent authority of Genesis 9:6, such as something new, whoever steals the property of man, by man shall his property be recovered, you will not find it in the scripture. The authority to recover property is part of the family authority, and it may be derivative from the family to be exercised by the civil government through express delegation. From the foregoing, it may thus be reasoned that familial persons may undertake a non-exclusive delegation of their authority to remedy injury to persons and recovery of property to a civil government, should that human institution be voluntarily established by the people. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13 and 14. Such a civil government may be delegated by corporate familial consent authority to remedy injury to property for offenses such as arson, theft, larceny, burglary, and robbery, property damage and vandalism, all types of fraud and deceit and extortion. We do not generally consider examples arising in the context of Israel's ancient government under God's specific laws for that purpose to learn of examples of how to remedy injury to persons or property, as that government by God as king, legislator, and supreme judge is of singular historic jurisdiction. Yet, we also see that God has never relinquished much of his authority to judge humans by his laws he laid down contemporaneously with the creation of the heavens and earth. This is the law of nature. By this law, God's decree and punishments for a variety of offenses has been reserved only to himself. He has not shared that jurisdiction with any human government. For instance, no human court has any lawful authority or jurisdiction to judge or punish unnatural sexual relations, greed, depravity, envy, strife, deceit, malice, gossip, slander, God hate, people that hate God, insolence, arrogance, boastfulness, disobedience to parents, a lack of understanding, fidelity, love, or mercy. Punishment of grumblers, malcontents, and loud-mouthed boasters are likewise beyond civil power. Jude 16. The civil punishment of hate crimes and misinformation do not make the list. Only the punishment of murder as an overt act was specifically modified to come within the power of humans to judge since Noah. Romans chapter 1, verse 26 to 32. Woo. Hold on, y'all. Get a little break in. Yeah, we're gonna end this and come back. I was trying to get this whole chapter done, but hold on, we're gonna finish. Hold on, let me see if we can finish this chapter. Yeah, we're gonna try to see if we finish this chapter. Let's see. They got the sound going in the lawnmowers. Let's finish this off. So it says, as we have also observed, familial authority to punish crimes against property and persons may also be arguably delegated to civil governments established and limited by the people. God alone judges these other matters. For those who maintain the civil government must have the authority to punish unnatural sexual relations. We note that the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment. 2 Peter 2:9. God's direct punishment of Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursue unnatural desires, serves as an example of his retained jurisdiction to punish such conduct. Jude 7. See also Romans 1:17. So God and no man imposes the due penalty for their error. Such conduct will be also judged by God in this world through corrupting the land in which it occurs. Leviticus 18, verse 24 to 28 is directed to Israel, but it has implications for any and every nation. Moses writes, "Do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things, for by all these the nations I am driving out before you have become unclean, and the land became unclean, so that I punished its iniquity, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you shall keep my statutes and my rules, and do none of these abominations, either the native or the stranger who sojourns among you. For the people of the land who were before you did all of these abominations, so that the land became unclean, lest the land vomit you out when you make it unclean, as it vomited out the nation that was before you." This judgment of vomit is really a direct way of saying the land was depopulated by war. This depopulation affects every person in the land, including those who commit such acts, as well as those who will not declare the true standard of conduct or speak out against sexual perversion. But this is God's judgment, not that of any civil government. Even though God ordered civil punishment of persons in ancient Israel who engaged in specifically enumerated sexual misconduct, see Leviticus chapter 18, verse 16 to 22. This example of civil punishment for these crimes is not a rule of general applicability for other nations. The crimes are wrong no matter the nation in which they are committed, but the punishments of Israel are limited to the law of the land and no other nation. We may also mention that what a person eats or drinks is not given over to the authority of any person, let alone civil government, to judge under law. This is bad news for the Food and Drug Administration, food police, and other government regulators. Likewise, how or when a person celebrates or declines to celebrate certain days, or how or when they celebrate or observe the Sabbath, also falls outside of any human authority to judge civilly. Religious leaders failed to grasp this principle when their state governors used the COVID-19 virus to subvert the rights of the people to worship. Likewise, enactment or enforcement of Sunday blue laws were never extended by the law of nature to any human authority. Colossians chapter 2, verse 16. Only God has authority over the human heart and human mind. As referred to above in Romans 1, God alone searches and probes the heart and mind. Jeremiah 17 and 10, Romans 20 and 12, Romans 8 and 27. No, Jeremiah 20 and 12 and Romans 8 and 27, excuse me. It is the peace and knowledge of God, not government control of education or public schools, which guards the heart and mind. Philippians 4 and verse 7. You can tell I'm getting a little exhausted or tired of reading and just sitting here. So, yet God has given parents the authority to direct, teach, and guide their children, but not to compel belief. They are not free to delegate away the educational duty a parent owes to God to any other person, and never to the civil government, though parents are free to retain others to assist them in performing this duty. Parents cannot delegate the duty to educate their children to the civil government like they may be free to delegate their right to recover injury to their person and property. God requires parents to account to Him concerning the education and upbringing of their own children, including the voluntary retention of agents and tutors to assist them. Civil governmental control of education fails the test of volition. It is built on the law of force and coercion. Failure to attend school is a crime. This is unlike a delegation to the civil government of the authority to remedy injury to persons and property, which a family member may elect to forego. That choice is no violation of any duty owed to God. In any event, God has not given authority over the heart or mind to any nation or civil government, And God continues to exclusively judge the content and motive of such heart and head matters to this very hour. Understanding the jurisdiction God has reserved to himself as a judge will help us to better understand the very limited nature of civil government. If you have never conceived of the civil government's jurisdiction as limited, you are missing out on the freedom God has extended to you to govern yourself, your family, and those voluntary associations you create. Man, we can talk about when civil government is the wrongdoer when I come back. I wanted to get this whole chapter in, but man, nah, it's a lot more. It's a little bit more, yeah. We'll finish this off at another date later on or something. Appreciate y'all. Hit the like, share this out, subscribe.